Zanil had never known a love so deep until the day she held her baby boy in her arms. The small hospital room in Port Harcourt faded into the background as she stared at his tiny fingers and listened to his soft cries. For a moment, nothing else mattered. She whispered promises to him, vowing to protect him and give him all the love she never had. At first, her husband Tay seemed just as overjoyed. He kissed her forehead, held the baby proudly, and told everyone how strong his wife had been. Zanil thought this was the beginning of their happiest chapter, but the warmth did not last long. Tay's mother, Ifeoma, made her dislike clear from the very start. She looked at Zanil with sharp, disapproving eyes and muttered that her son deserved someone better. To her, Zanil was an outsider, a young woman unworthy of the family name. Other relatives followed Ifeoma's lead, whispering cruel words behind Zanil's back, sometimes even in her presence. Zanil felt the chill each time she walked into the family home. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations cut short when she entered the room. Yet in the middle of that coldness, her baby was her light. She would cradle him close, breathing in his warmth, feeling his heartbeat against hers. Whenever she kissed his soft cheek, the pain of rejection softened, if only for a little while. Though the world around her felt hostile, Zanil clung to the joy of motherhood. Her baby was her comfort, her shield, and the reason she kept smiling through the bitterness of her in-law. At first, Zanil thought the cold looks and whispers from her in-laws would fade with time. She believed that once they saw how much she loved her baby, they would soften. But Ifeoma's heart only grew harder. Every chance she got, she told Tay that Zanil was not strong enough to care for a child. She is too fragile, she would say. This baby needs a real family, not a weak girl who will break under pressure. Tay, who once held Zanil's hand and called her his queen, slowly began to listen to his mother. At first, he defended his wife, but Ifeoma's voice was relentless, dripping into his ears day after day. Our tradition is clear, she reminded. The child belongs to the husband's family. What if she runs away with him? What if she fails him? Think of your bloodline. These words planted seeds of doubt in Tay's heart. Behind closed doors, Ifeoma and Tay began to plan. They spoke in low voices when Zanil was not around, pausing quickly whenever she entered the room. Sometimes she would catch a sharp glance between them or notice their hushed tones, but she convinced herself it was nothing. She told herself they were simply discussing family matters, maybe finances, maybe household issues. She wanted to believe her husband would never betray her. But the signs were there. She noticed how Tay no longer smiled at her as warmly as before. He started spending more time with his mother, returning late and avoiding her questions. Ifeoma became bolder too, walking into Zanil's room and holding the baby for too long, her grip too tight, her eyes too possessive. Zanil's heart often raced with an unnamed fear, but she swallowed it down. She told herself she was just tired, just overthinking because of the sleepless nights that come with a newborn. She didn't want to seem paranoid, especially not when her in-laws already called her unworthy. Still, the air in the house grew heavier each day. Conversations stopped the moment she entered. Smiles faded. Whispers filled the corners of rooms. Sometimes, as she lay in bed at night, she could hear her husband's voice outside the door, low and urgent, his mother's tone sharp and commanding. When she asked about it, Tay brushed her off with a quick, "It's nothing, don't worry." But there was something to worry about. A storm was quietly building around her, and Zanil, lost in her love for her baby, had no idea how close it was to breaking. She kissed her son's forehead each night, never knowing that the arms that held him so tightly would soon be forced to let go. The plot against her was set, and the family she had tried to belong to was preparing to shatter her world. The night it happened began like any other. Zanil lay on her mat, her baby pressed against her chest. The little boy's breathing was soft and steady, his tiny body warm in her arms. She kissed his forehead and whispered a prayer for his future before slowly drifting into sleep. For once, she allowed herself to believe that maybe the worst was behind her. But deep in the night, shadows moved quietly in her room. Zanil stirred slightly, half asleep, not realizing what was happening. By the time her eyes opened fully, it was too late. Her baby was no longer in her arms. Her heart stopped. She sat up quickly, searching in the darkness, her hands trembling as they felt the empty mat. Then her eyes darted to the crib. Empty. Panic rose in her throat. She let out a scream that tore through the night, a sound filled with raw terror. My baby. Where is my baby? In the dim light, she saw them. Tay and his mother, Ifeoma, standing near the door. Her baby was clutched tightly in Ifeoma's arms. Zanil scrambled to her feet, begging, reaching out, her voice breaking. Please give him back to me. He needs me. I am his mother. But Ifeoma's face was like stone, her eyes cold and unfeeling. Her words cut like a knife. He belongs to us now. You are not worthy of him. Zanil fell to her knees, clutching the edge of the crib, sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She turned to her husband, her last hope. "Tay, please. You're his father. Don't do this to me." But Tay avoided her eyes. His silence was louder than Ifeoma's cruelty. The cries echoed through the compound, drawing neighbors out of their homes. One by one, doors opened, and sleepy faces appeared. They saw Zanil stumbling outside, her hair loose, her wrapper barely clinging to her body. She cried out to anyone who would listen. "They took my baby. They stole my son." Some neighbors whispered to each other, too afraid to interfere. Others shook their heads in pity, but no one stepped forward. Tradition, fear, and gossip held them back. Zanil collapsed on the dirt road, her screams turning into weak sobs. She stretched her hands toward the house, but the door slammed shut, locking her child away from her. That night, the sky seemed darker than ever. The village went quiet again, but Zanil's cries lingered in the air, haunting those who had heard them. Alone, broken, and powerless, she lay on the cold ground with only the echo of her baby's last cry ringing in her ears. It was the night her world shattered, the night a mother's arms were left empty. Days after that night, Zanil's world felt empty. She could no longer hear her baby's cries or feel his tiny body in her arms. Each morning, she woke hoping it had all been a nightmare, only to remember that he was gone. The house, once filled with warmth and new life, now seemed like a prison, every corner echoing the absence of her child. Ifeoma made sure Zanil had no chance to see him. Every visit, every plea was met with cold refusal. "You are not fit to hold him," Ifeoma said over and over, her voice sharp and final. The villagers, who once nodded at Zanil's quiet smiles, now whispered when she passed by. Some nodded in sympathy, but many had heard Ifeoma's version, that Zanil was unstable, weak, and unworthy of her own child. Zanil tried to fight the whispers at first. She explained herself, pleaded her case, but words bounced off ears that were already convinced by lies. Her hope began to fade, replaced by a heavy, aching sadness. She wandered through the village with swollen eyes, trying to hide her tears, but it was impossible. Children she had once played with avoided her, shopkeepers looked at her with suspicion, and even some distant relatives crossed the street to avoid her. At night, she sat alone in her small room, clutching a blanket that still smelled faintly of her baby. She thought about all the moments she would never have. His first steps, his first words, the first time he would call her mama. Each imagined scene tore at her heart. She felt powerless, trapped by lies that were slowly consuming her life. Even Tay, who had once seemed like her partner in this journey, remained distant. He smiled less, spoke less, and when he did, his words were empty. Zanil could see the shadow of the man she loved, replaced by the influence of a mother who seemed to control his every thought. But in the deepest parts of her grief, a small spark of determination still flickered. Every tear she shed reminded her of what had been taken. Every cruel word of gossip fueled a quiet rage inside her. She walked through the village each day, beaten but not yet broken, carrying the memory of her son in her heart. Weeks stretched into months, and Zanil's sorrow grew heavier, but she refused to let it crush her completely. Though the villagers' eyes were cold and the in-laws' lies were sharp, she held on to the hope that someday, somehow, she would see her child again. Her pain was deep, but within it, the seed of strength was quietly taking root, waiting for the moment she would finally stand up and fight. Zanil had never been inside Mr. Adekunal's home before, but that day she found herself walking up the creaking steps with a mixture of fear and hope. Her body was still tired from sleepless nights, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but something inside her pushed her forward. She had heard from her late father, long ago, that Mr. Adekunal was wise and fair, a man who had fought many battles in court and won. Now, she needed that strength more than ever. The door opened before she could knock, and a kind, older man with silver hair and gentle eyes welcomed her in. He listened quietly as Zanil's words tumbled out, her voice shaking with grief and anger. She told him everything, the coldness of her in-laws, the night her baby was taken, the lies spread about her mental health, and the way Tay had fallen under his mother's control. She spoke until her throat ached, and tears rolled freely down her cheeks. Mr. Adekunal didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply nodded, his eyes full of understanding, letting her pour out her pain until there was nothing left to say. When she finally stopped, gasping for breath, he leaned forward and placed a firm hand on hers. "Zanil," he said softly but firmly, "no tradition is above the law. What they are doing is wrong, and it can be challenged. If you are ready, we will fight for your child." The words sank into her heart like sunlight breaking through clouds. For the first time in weeks, Zanil felt a flicker of hope. She wiped her tears, her hands trembling, but her eyes began to shine with determination. She thought of her baby, the small life that depended on her, and she realized she could no longer be passive. She had to act. Mr. Adekunle explained how they could take the case to court, how evidence and witnesses could prove that the baby belonged with her, the mother who had cared and loved him from the first moment. He promised to guide her every step, to stand by her even if the in-laws laughed and scoffed at her courage. Zanil left his home that day with her shoulders a little straighter and her heart a little lighter. The fear and despair that had weighed on her seemed smaller somehow, replaced by a new fire. She could still feel the sting of what had been taken from her, but now it was matched by a growing determination to fight for what was right. As she walked through the streets of Port Harcourt, she imagined holding her baby again, feeling his tiny hands in hers. That vision, once a dream, now felt possible. The tears she had cried in secret were replaced by a quiet strength, a spark that refused to be snuffed out. Zanil finally understood that her pain could become power, and that her love for her child was a force strong enough to challenge even the cruelest of obstacles. The morning of the court hearing, Zanil felt a mix of fear and resolve. She had spent nights thinking about this day, imagining the moment she might finally see her baby again. Mr. Adekunle had prepared everything carefully, the paperwork, the witnesses, the evidence of lies and threats. For the first time since her baby was taken, she felt a quiet confidence. Across town, Ifeoma and Tay were already making their plans known. They laughed openly in the market, mocking the idea that a judge would ever side with a poor, weak girl. No court will give her the child, Ifeoma sneered to neighbors who stopped to listen. Tay, once hesitant, now strode arrogantly beside his mother, certain that wealth, tradition, and family power would protect them. Zanil, in contrast, arrived at the courthouse quietly. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied back, her eyes steady. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held on to something stronger than fear, faith. Her lawyer, Mr. Adekunle, guided her through the crowds of people, some curious, some indifferent. She barely noticed the whispers or stares, her focus entirely on the room where justice would be decided. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick. Tay walked in with his family behind him, heads held high, smirking at Zanil as though the courtroom itself belonged to them. Zanil followed behind Mr. Adekunle, small and quiet, carrying no pride but an unshakable belief that her love for her child was more powerful than any threat or insult. The hearing began with the in-laws presenting their case. They spoke loudly, painting Zanil as fragile, incapable, and unstable. Ifeoma's voice rang through the courtroom with practiced confidence. Tay nodded along, adding weight to their story, hoping the judge would be impressed by their wealth, their family name, and their authority. Zanil sat silently, letting their words wash over her. She knew the truth was her weapon. She didn't need to shout or argue. She only needed to be ready to speak when the time came. Around her, she noticed sympathetic glances from neighbors, nurses, and friends who knew the real story. They would help, she realized, if she let them. As the first part of the hearing ended, Zanil felt her heart racing. The courtroom was no longer just a place for arguments. It was the battlefield where she would fight for her son. Her hands were clenched in her lap, and she whispered to herself, "I will get him back. I have to." She looked at Mr. Adekunle, and he gave her a small nod. No matter what happened, they would stand together. The next steps would be hard, the battle long, but for the first time since losing her child, Zanil felt ready to face whatever came next. She had faith, courage, and truth on her side, and for a mother fighting for her baby, that was everything. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on the small figure of Zanil as the in-laws began their story. Ifeoma's voice was sharp and commanding as she painted Zanil as weak, unstable, and unworthy of her own child. She described Zanil as incapable of caring for the baby, exaggerating every mistake, every tear, every sleepless night, twisting them into proof of her supposed failure. Tay nodded along, adding weight to the lies, speaking loudly so that everyone could hear that Zanil was not fit to be a mother. Zanil sat quietly, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart pounding. The words stung, but she knew the truth would speak louder than any lie. When the judge finally turned to her, asking her to speak, her voice trembled at first, soft but firm. "Your Honor," she began, "they took my son in the middle of the night. I woke up to an empty crib, and I begged them to give him back. Every night since, I have cried for him, worried for him, and longed to hold him again." She recounted the night clearly, painting the picture of the fear, the pain, and the helplessness she had felt. Her words carried the raw emotion of a mother who had been robbed of her child, and even the coldest corners of the room seemed to feel her despair. She spoke of the days spent trying to see her baby, only to be blocked at every turn, of the lies spread about her mental state, and of the sleepless nights spent waiting, hoping, and praying for her child's safety. Then the witnesses came forward. A kind neighbor, who had watched the theft from outside, described Zanil's collapse in the street, her screams echoing through the village. The neighbor confirmed that Zanil had always been gentle and loving with her baby, contradicting the claims of instability. Next, a nurse from the hospital spoke. She explained how Zanil had cared for the baby from birth, noting her patience, dedication, and the countless nights she had stayed awake tending to him. Her testimony was factual, calm, and undeniable, leaving little room for the lies that Ifeoma and Tay had spun. The courtroom listened, wrapped in quiet, as the truth unfolded. The in-laws' confident faces faltered slightly, and Tay's arrogance seemed to shrink under the weight of the evidence. Zanil's voice, though still trembling, grew stronger with each word. She realized that the more she spoke, the lighter the weight on her heart became. By the time she finished, the room was filled with a mixture of awe and quiet sympathy. The truth had been spoken, witnesses had confirmed it, and Zanil stood there no longer as a broken mother, but as a woman fighting for her child with courage and clarity. It was the moment she had been waiting for, the first real step toward getting her baby back. The courtroom fell silent as the judge rose from his seat, his robes flowing around him. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the words that could change everything. For a moment, even the whispers stopped, and all that could be heard was the soft rustle of paper. Zanil sat upright, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her heart hammering in her chest. The judge's voice was calm but firm. No family has the right to take a child from its mother without proof of harm or incapacity, he said. His eyes scanned the room, stopping briefly on Ifeoma and Tay. A mother's love, care, and dedication cannot be dismissed by claims based on prejudice, tradition, or false accusations. A tense pause followed, and Zanil felt her chest tighten. Then the judge spoke the words she had been praying to hear. Zanil is hereby declared the rightful custodian of her child. She is to have full custody, and the child must be returned to her immediately. A stunned silence gripped the room. Ifeoma's face turned pale, her lips trembling as her body swayed. Before anyone could reach her, she collapsed onto the floor, fainting from the shock. Tay, standing rigid beside her, buried his face in his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The arrogance and confidence he had carried into the courtroom were gone, replaced by shame and disbelief. Zanil's knees shook, and tears streamed down her face. But these were different tears. They were not born of despair or helplessness, but of relief, triumph, and the overwhelming joy of justice finally being done. She had fought for her child, and now the fight was over. She felt the weight that had crushed her for months lift slightly, replaced by a rush of happiness she had not felt in a long time. Around her, neighbors and onlookers whispered in awe, some clapping softly, others nodding in approval. Even the nurse who had testified smiled, her eyes shining as she looked at Zanil. The courtroom that had once felt like a place of judgment and fear now seemed lighter, almost alive with the sense of right prevailing over cruelty. Zanil took a deep breath, steadying herself as she looked toward the door, imagining the moment she would finally hold her baby again. Every hardship, every sleepless night, every tear she had cried led to this moment. Justice had been served, and her child would finally be back where he belonged, in her arms. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel free, whole, and unshakably strong. The road had been long and painful, but standing there in the courtroom, tears on her cheeks, she knew that she had not just won a case. She had reclaimed her life and her son. The future, once uncertain and terrifying, now held the promise of love, peace, and the quiet joy of a mother reunited with her child. The moment finally came. A court officer stepped forward, holding Zanil's baby gently in his arms. Zanil felt her heart leap as tears welled up, blurring her vision. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing the soft skin of her son's cheeks. "My baby, my son," she whispered, her voice breaking. The little boy cooed softly, unaware of the storm of emotions surrounding him, and instinctively lifted his tiny hands toward her. As she pulled him close, cradling him against her chest, Zanil felt a wave of relief and love unlike anything she had known. Her arms were finally where they belonged, and she refused to let go. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering, "No one will ever take you from me again." Every word carried the weight of months of fear, pain, and longing, and the baby responded with a small, innocent sigh, as if he understood her promise. Around them, the courtroom was filled with quiet, awed spectators. Some had tears in their eyes, others nodded in silent admiration, moved by the sight of a mother reunited with her child. The weight of the lies, the cruelty, and the months of separation seemed to melt in that single moment, leaving only love and triumph. Ifeoma, her face twisted with disbelief and anger, stormed out of the courtroom, her robes brushing the floor as she disappeared into the hallway. She had lost, and there was no way to hide it. Tay followed silently, his head bowed, his arrogance replaced with shame. Zanil barely looked at them. Her focus was entirely on the baby in her arms. She walked toward the courtroom doors, her steps steady, the baby cradled tightly against her chest. Each step was a small victory, a reclaiming of what had been taken from her. Spectators watched quietly, some whispering words of encouragement, some offering gentle smiles, but all moved by the powerful image of a mother and her child finally together. As she stepped into the sunlight outside, Zenil felt a sense of freedom she had not known since the night her baby was stolen. She held him high for a brief moment, letting the warmth of the sun touch both of them. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of hope restored, of love that could not be broken by lies or cruelty. For Zenil, the journey had been long and painful, but now it ended with her baby safe in her arms. The months of heartache, sleepless nights, and bitter whispers of the in-laws faded away. All that mattered was the tiny, perfect life she held close, the soft coos and tiny fingers gripping her. At that moment, nothing else existed, only the unshakable bond between a mother and her child, finally reunited at last. Back in Port Harcourt, Zenil took a deep breath as she stepped into her new life. The city felt brighter somehow, full of possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine before. She held her baby close, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against hers, a reminder of everything she had fought for and won. The months of pain and fear still lingered in her memory, but they no longer controlled her. With Mr. Adecunnell's guidance, Zenil opened a small business, a tiny shop selling fabrics and crafts. It wasn't much at first, but it was hers. Each day, she arranged the shelves, greeted customers, and balanced the books with care. Slowly, the shop began to attract more people. Neighbors who had once whispered and doubted her now came to offer support, admiring the quiet determination that seemed to radiate from her. Every sale, every smile, was a step toward rebuilding her life on her own terms. Zenil also dedicated herself to raising her son with love and dignity. She taught him small things as he grew, how to speak kindly, how to share, how to be brave in the face of hardship. Every night, she held him close, whispering stories of courage, of hope, of the strength that had carried them through the darkest days. She knew that her own struggles had forged a resilience inside her, a strength that no one could take away. Looking out over the little shop and the small life she had built, Zenil felt a quiet pride. Pain had taught her lessons she would never forget, but it had also shown her what she was truly capable of. She smiled down at her son, her heart full, and whispered to herself, "They tried to take everything from me, but the law, and my own courage, gave me back more than I ever lost."